There was a great BBC series where they focus on the secret life of plants just by speeding up things 10 or 100 times.
Yes.
And they look very sentient when you do that.
Yes. Our ancestors said that one day in fairyland is 7 years in human land. Maybe this alludes to this temporal difference.
Mm-hmm. So about differences between you all, why don't we linger on consciousness? And Carl, if you don't mind answering, what is consciousness? Where is consciousness? And why is consciousness? So in other words, where is it? Is it in the brain? Is it in the entire body? Is it an ill-defined question? What is it? Why do we have it? What is its function? And then we'll see where this compares and contrasts with Joscha's thinking.
Right. Yeah, I am not a philosopher, and sometimes the story I will tell depends on who I am talking to. But at its simplest, I find it easiest to think of consciousness as a process as opposed to a thing or a state, and specifically a process of computation, if you like, or belief updating. So I normally start thinking about questions of the kind you just asked me, but replacing consciousness with evolution. So where is evolution? What is evolution? Why is evolution? Then all of those questions I think are quite easy to answer. Sometimes it's a stupid question. Sometimes there's a very clear answer. So, where is consciousness? Where is evolution? Well, it is in the substrate that is evolving. So, where is consciousness? It will be in the processes that you are ascribing consciousness. So, I would say it is actually the computation or the information processing, the belief updating that you get at any level, and just fully acknowledging Josh's point that it doesn't have to be neurons. It could be mycelial networks. It could be intracellular communication. It could be electrical filaments. As long as there is a physical instantiation of a process that can be read as a kind of belief updating or processing. If I were allowed to read computation, as that kind of process, then that would have that would be, I think, where consciousness would be found. Would that be sufficient to ascribe consciousness to me or to something else? I suspect not. I think you'd have to go a little bit further, and suspect that Joshua wants to now articulate how much further, but there will be a focus on self-modeling. So it's not just a process of inference. It's actually inference under a kind of model of the world. And I would, I'm quite happy committing to a generative model as formally specified in terms of variational inference, but we can relax that and just say some kind of model of the world that entails a certain aspect of selfhood to it. So that's what I would say. I put something else into the mix as well. That to be conscious, I suspect, in the way that you're talking about, means you have to be an agent. And to be an agent means that you have to be able to act. And I would say more than just acting, say, for example, in the way that plants will act to broadcast information that enables them to mount an immune response to parasites. They have the capacity to plan. And which brings us back to the curiosity again, because, we normally plan in order to resolve uncertainty. We normally plan our day and the way that we spend our time gathering information, gathering evidence from models of the world in a way that can only be described as looks as if it is curious. That's why I was so fixated on art and creativity and curiosity that Joshua was talking about previously. I think that is probably a prerequisite for being conscious in the sense that Joshua would mean it. But I don't know. Perhaps we should ask him that.
May I ask you a clarifying question, Carl, about belief updating? So if consciousness is associated with belief updating, then let's say one is a computer, a classical computer. You get updated in discrete steps, whereas the belief updating that I imagine you're referring to is something more fuzzy or continuous. So does that mean that the consciousness associated with a computer, if a computer could be conscious, is of a different sort? How does that work?
I'm not sure. I don't think there's any, in the same spirit that we don't want to, overcommit to neurons doing mind work. I don't think we need to commit to a continuous or discrete space-time formulation. Again, it's that's an artificial divide between classical physics and quantum information theoretic approaches. So I think the deeper question is what properties must the computational process in a PC or a computer possess before you would be licensed to make the inference that it was conscious and possibly even ascribe self-consciousness to that? And the way that I would articulate that would be that you have to be able to describe everything that is observable about that computing artifact as if, or explain it in terms of it acting upon the world in a way that suggests or can be explained that it has a model of itself engaging with that world. And furthermore, I would say that that model has to involve the consequences of its action, which is what I meant by being an agent. So it has to have a model that, or act as if it has a model, a generative model that could be a minimal self kind of model, but crucially entails the consequences of its own actions so that it can plan, so that it can evince curious-like behavior. So that could be done in silico. It could be done with a sort of clock and synchronous or asynchronous message passing of a discrete sort, or it could be done in analog. It could be done with photonics. It could be done under neuromorphic architecture. I don't think that really matters. I think it's more the nature of the implicit model under the hood that is accounting for its internal machinations, but more practically in terms of what I can observe of that computer, its behavior and the way that it goes and gathers information, or attends to certain things and doesn't attend to other things.
Okay, great. Joscha.
If we think about where consciousness is, we might be biased by our propensity to assign identity to everything. And identity does not apply to law-like things. Gravity is not somewhere. Gravity is a law, for instance, or combustion is not anywhere. It's a law. This doesn't mean that it happens everywhere in the same way. It only happens when the conditions for the manifestation of the law are implemented. When they're realized in a certain region, then we can observe combustion happening. But combustion simply means that under certain conditions, you will get an exothermic reaction. And gravity means that under certain conditions, you will find that objects attract each other. And consciousness means that if you set up a system in a certain way, you will observe the following phenomena. Consciousness in this way is software state. It's a representational state. And all software is not a thing. But the word processor that runs on your computer doesn't have an identity that would make it separate or the same as the word processor that runs on another person's computer, because it's a law. It says if you put the transistors into this state, the following thing is going to happen. So a software engineer is discovering a law, a very, very specific law that is tailored to a particular task and so on. But it's manifested whenever we create the preconditions for that law. And so the software design is about creating the preconditions for the manifestation of a law of text processing, for instance, that allows you to implement such a function in the universe or discover how it is implemented. But it's not because the software engineer wills it into existence and it didn't exist before that. That's not the case, right? It always would work. If somebody discovers this this bit string in a random way, and it's the same bit string implemented on the same architecture, it would still perform the same function. And in a sense, I think that consciousness is not separate in different people. It's itself a mechanism, a principle that increases coherence in the mind. It's an operator that seems to be increasing coherence. At least that's the way I would look at it or frame it. And as a result, it produces a sense of now, an island of coherence in the potential models that our mind could have. And I think it's responsible for this fact that we perceive ourselves being inhabitants of an island of coherence in a chaotic world. This island of nowness. And it's probably not the only solution for this thing. I think it's imaginable that there could be a hyperconsciousness that allows you to see multiple possibilities simultaneously rather than just one, as our consciousness does, or that offers us a now that is not 3 seconds long, but hundreds of years long. In principle, that I think is conceivable. So maybe we will have systems at some point, or maybe we already have them, that have different consciousness-like structures that fulfill a similar role of islands of coherence or interpretable regions in the space of representations that allow you to act on the universe. But the way it seems to be implemented in myself, it's particularly in the brain, because if I disrupt my brain, my consciousness ceases, whereas if I disrupt my body, it doesn't. This doesn't mean that there are not feedback loops that are bidirectional into my body or even outside of my body that are crucial for some functionality that I observe as a content in my consciousness. But if you want to make me unconscious, you need to clobber my brain in some sense, nothing else. There's no other part of the universe that you can inhibit to make me unconscious, and that leads me to think that the way in which this law-like structure is implemented is right now for the system that is talking to you on my neurons, on my brain, mostly.
Okay, any objections there, Carl?
No, not at all. I was just trying to remember if Mark Soames were here, he'd tell you exactly the size of a really small region in the brainstem. I think it's less than 4 cubic millimeters. That if you ablated, you would immediately lose consciousness like that. So it's a very, very specific part of your neural architecture that permits conscious processing.
But there are also very specific parts in my computer that are extremely small that I could obliterate and ablate, and
Yes.
I would instantly lead to the cessation of all the interesting functions of my computer. And there are many of such regions, where there are basically crucial bottlenecks that enable a large-scale functionality. In some sense, everything that would disrupt the formation of coherent patterns in my brain is sufficient to inhibit my consciousness. And there are probably many such bottlenecks that provide the vulnerability. So maybe the claustrum is crucial in providing some clock function that is crucial for the formation of feedback loops in the brain that give rise to the kind of patterns that we need. Maybe there are several other such bottlenecks. This doesn't mean that the functionality is exclusively implemented in this bottleneck.
No, I didn't mean to imply that the pineal gland
I didn't think that you would,
the...
but I thought it could lead to a misunderstanding of the audience. And I've heard famous neuroscientists point at such phenomena and say, oh, maybe this is where consciousness happens.
Right.
And I think this is almost a superstitious belief. It's like saying, oh, there is this particular chip on my computer. If I destroy it, the computer doesn't work anymore. And maybe this was just a quartz or something else rather than the stuff that is providing the interesting functionality.
Or the lead to the battery, perhaps.
Yeah.
So which neuroscientist has said this then?
I'm not naming names.
You email me afterwards, right? So, just to unpack, the reason that Mark would identify this is that it is exactly the cells of origin that are broadcast everywhere that do induce exactly this coherence you were talking about. These are the ascending modulatory neurotransmitter systems that are responsible for orchestrating that coherence that you were talking about. And I think that's very nice because it also speaks to the ability of sort of conscious mimicking like artifacts whose abilities to mimic consciousness like behavior rests upon this modulatory attentional like mechanism. And I'm thinking again of attention heads and transformers that play the same kind of role as the selection that these ascending neurotransmitter systems do. So if you find yourself in conversation with Mark Soames, he would argue that the feeling of consciousness arises from equipping certain coherent, coordinated interactions that may be regulated by the cerebellum or the colostrum, but it is that regulation that actually equips consciousness with the kind of qualitative feeling that, at least in the way that Mark Soames addresses it. But I mean, just notice that just reviewing what Josh just said there, he's talking about consciousness, you're equipping us with a sense of now and having an explicit aspect that could be, I'm thinking of not Husserl, but well, actually Jerry Edelman's notion of the remembered present. Which could be the cognitive moment, 300 milliseconds, or it could be if I was a tree 3 years. I think it's a lovely notion, but the point being, we're talking about processes in time. We're not saying at this instant I am conscious or consciousness is here. We're talking about a process that by definition has to unfold in time. So, I think that's an important observation, which sometimes eludes, I think, people debating about conscious states and conscious content, not acknowledging that it is a process. It is a process. What was the example that Joshua mentioned?
Combustion.
Combustion is a process. You can't be in a state of combustion, and you could even argue that it's very difficult to localize at a certain level. But the key thing is it's a process.
I have an open question, and maybe you have a reflection on this. When we think about our own consciousness, we cannot know in principle, I think, but just by introspection, whether we have multiple consciousness in our own mind, because we can only remember those conscious states that find their way into an integrated protocol that you can access from where you stand. And we know that there are some people which have a multiple personality disorder in which the protocol itself gets splintered. As a result, they don't dream to be just one person. They dream to be alternating, to be different people that usually don't remember each other because they don't have that shared protocol anymore. Now, my own emotion and perception is generated outside of my personal self. My personal self is downstream from them. I am subjected to my perception and emotion. I have involuntary reactions to them. But to produce my percepts and my emotion, my mind needs intelligence. Right? It cannot be much more stupid than me. If my emotions would guide me in a way that is consistently more stupid than my reason and my reflection would be, I don't think I would work. So there is an interesting question. Is there a secondary consciousness? Is the part of your mind that generates world model and your self-assessment, your alignment to the world, it's self-conscious? So basically, do you share your brain with a second consciousness that has a separate protocol? Or is this a non-conscious process that is basically just dumb and doesn't know what it's doing? In a sense that it would be sentient in a way that's similar to my own sentience. What do you think?
Kurt, you should have a go at that one, and then I can think about it.
Well, something I had wondered about 10 years ago or so, and I don't recall the exact argument, was that if it was the case that the graph in our brain, let's just reduce the neurons down to a graph, that this graph somehow produces consciousness or is the same as consciousness, then if you were to remove one of those nodes, then you would still have a somewhat the same identity. Okay, so then does that mean that we have pretty much an infinite amount of overlapping consciousnesses within our brain? I don't recall the exact argument, but it was similar to this. And then there's something related in philosophy called the binding problem. I'm uncertain what people who study multiple personality disorders have to say about the binding problem. Like, is that the binding problem gone awry?
Can I just then pursue that notion of the binding in the context of the kind of thing that, or the way I am at the moment? Yeah, I think that's a very compelling notion. From the point of view of generative modeling, so I'm not as answering now as a philosopher, but as somebody who may be tasked, for example, with building an artifact that would have a minimal kind of selfhood. The first thing you have to write down is different states of mind so that I can be frightened, I can be embarrassed, I can be angry, I can be a father, I could be a football player, I could be, so all the different ways that I could be that are now conditioned upon the context in which I find myself. And if that's part of the generative model, that then speaks to two things. That first of all, you have to recognize what state of mind you are in, and given all the evidence at hand. So, for example, if I want to jointly explain the racing heart that my interoceptive cues are providing me in the interoceptive domain with a stiffness of my muscles that my proprioception is equipping me with, to reconcile that with my visual exoreceptive input, that I'm in a dark alley and mnemonically I've never been here before. All of this sensory evidence might be quite easily explained by the simple hypothesis, I am frightened. And that in turn generates covert or mental actions, and possibly even overt autonomic actions and motor actions that provide more evidence for the fact that I am frightened, in the sense, in a William James sense, that I'll have cardiac acceleration, I will have a motor response, a muscular response appropriate for a fright or flight response. So just to actually be able to generate and recognize emotional kinds of behavior, I would need to have a minimal kind of model that crucially obliged me now to disambiguate between a series of different ways of being.
If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here. Enjoy. Subscribe to Theories of Everything to get notified of upcoming podcasts, as there are new full-length podcasts every week on the topics of mathematics, physics, consciousness, free will, and AI.